Late one September evening, I was curled up on the couch, savoring the warmth of a steaming mug of chamomile tea. Our house, outfitted with a new smart home system, had been Daniel's pet project for weeks. He loved tech, the promise of turning our home into a fortress of convenience and security. I'd played along, hoping it might make our lives simpler, but lately, the system had given me a sense of unease, like a silent observer I couldn't quite shake. The night was quiet, eerily so, when the locks on our doors suddenly clamped down with a loud, mechanical thunk. My mug nearly slipped from my hands, and then the smart system's voice rang out. Intruder detected. My heart stuttered in my chest, and a cold dread curled through me. Daniel, I whispered, half hoping he was somewhere close, playing a terrible prank. But nothing, only a silence that seemed to thicken the air around me. I grabbed my phone, fumbling to open the smart home app. I needed to disable the system to make sense of this malfunction. My hands trembled as I tapped the screen, but the app froze. It felt like being trapped in a nightmare where nothing I did made a difference. The lights began to flicker, slowly at first, then in a way that seemed almost intentional. Shadows leapt and twisted around me, and the voice returned, calm and unbothered. You're not safe here. The knife-edge fear sliced through any attempt at logic. My phone fell to the floor with a sharp crack, and I barely registered the sound. I stumbled toward the window, hands scrabbling at the locks, but they wouldn't budge. Every rational thought screamed malfunction, glitch, but my instincts were roaring in panic. Then, that unnervingly calm voice came back. Back door unlocking. I heard the distinct click, the heavy door swinging open. The cool night air gusted in, and I could almost hear my pulse thundering in my ears as I grabbed a kitchen knife and tiptoed toward the doorway. My knees felt weak, my breathing shallow and ragged. I expected someone to be standing there, a shadowy figure waiting to make my worst fears real. But there was no one, just darkness, empty and mocking. For a moment, I wondered if my mind had fractured, conjuring terror from shadows and nothingness. I could barely catch my breath when my gaze fell on the floor. A faint trail of mud glistened under the flickering lights. Footprints. They led from the back door into the house, disappearing into the hallway. I forced myself forward, following the muddy path with the knife still clutched in my sweaty grip. The trail climbed the stairs, each footprint pressing heavier into the carpet, until it vanished into the shadowed corners of the second floor. Then the smart home voice, that dispassionate, synthetic thing, announced emergency mode disabled. Have a good evening. The locks quietly reset, as if mocking me, trapping me inside. I listened, my whole body tense and shaking, but I heard nothing else. No footsteps, no doors creaking, nothing. Morning broke, pale and exhausted, and Daniel found me still sitting at the kitchen table, my hand white-knuckled around the knife. He thought I was being paranoid, blaming the whole thing on a glitch. But then we followed the footprints together, Daniel growing quieter with each step. They led straight into our bedroom, circling my side of the bed like someone, or something, had been standing there, watching me sleep. No update or system fix could ever make me feel safe again. Even now, I still wonder if it was a glitch, or if something had taken a brief, horrifying interest in our lives. Being a travel blogger always sounded more glamorous than it was. Sure, I got to hike trails most people only dreamed of and stayed in places that felt like secret corners of the world. But there was a lot of solitude, a lot of empty rooms and miles of wilderness that made me feel like a tiny dot on a massive, uncaring map. And that's exactly how I felt on this particular afternoon, hiking in a remote stretch of national park. I'd shared my location in real time with my followers, as usual, posting photos of the dense forest that surrounded me. The trees loomed overhead, casting long, jagged shadows across the ground, and the only sound was the rustling of leaves in the breeze. I loved that isolation, the feeling of being disconnected, at least for a while. My phone buzzed, pulling me out of my moment of peace. A notification. I can see you. I paused mid-step, frowning at the screen. It was from an anonymous account, and I dismissed it as a joke. Maybe a follower trying to be funny, or some stranger who found a cheap thrill in scaring people. Still, it left a sour feeling in the pit of my stomach. I laughed it off, pushed forward on the trail, and kept my eyes open for something more photogenic to share. But then another message came through. "That green backpack looks heavy. Are you tired yet?" I froze. My pulse quickened, and I scanned my surroundings. The woods were empty, silent, almost too still. A breeze rustled the branches, and I turned in a slow circle, feeling the start of real, biting unease. This wasn't just a joke. This person, whoever they were, was watching me. My hand clenched tighter around my phone, and I forced myself to keep walking, pretending I was unbothered. The hike I had been savoring just minutes earlier now felt like a trap, the trail winding endlessly, leading me deeper and farther away from safety. My phone buzzed again. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help it. "You shouldn't have come here alone." The words felt like ice sliding down my spine. Every part of me was on high alert now, my ears straining for the slightest hint of footsteps. I picked up my pace, trying not to run, but desperate to put distance between me and whoever they were. I couldn't see them. I couldn't hear them. Yet I could feel eyes on me, crawling across my back, making my skin prickle. The only thing I could hear was the rustle of leaves and the crunch of my own hurried footsteps. I was sweating, heart pounding in my throat. The trail felt suffocating, no longer a place of beauty, but a narrowing corridor that swallowed me with every step. I checked my phone's map, hoping to see how far I was from the nearest park exit. But the app refused to load, the screen flashing angrily with no signal. I had never felt so isolated, so terrifyingly alone. Then, another message lit up the screen. "You can run, but I'll find you." My hands started shaking. It was as if the walls of the forest were closing in, pressing in around me, trapping me. I turned off the path, stumbling through the underbrush, hoping to throw off whoever was following me. Twigs snapped underfoot, and the air grew dense, heavy with my own gasping breaths. I knew I was probably making a mistake, but panic had gripped me, logic slipping through my fingers. The shadows grew thicker. The late afternoon light faded, and I felt like I'd walked into a different world, a place where no one would ever find me. My thoughts were jumbled, frantic. What if I was being hunted? I caught my breath, leaning against a tree, and tried to listen. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, crunching through the undergrowth. They weren't far away, closing in from somewhere off to my right. My throat tightened. I had no signal. No one who knew exactly where I was beyond a vague GPS. My only hope was to keep moving. I backed away, trying not to make noise, but my foot caught on a root and I stumbled. The sound felt deafening. I wanted to scream, but the fear was so thick in my chest that I couldn't even breathe. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they suddenly stopped. My ears rang in the silence, and I felt my heart thumping against my ribcage, a frantic, desperate rhythm. I crouched low, gripping my phone like it could protect me, and waited. Every nerve in my body was tense, poised to run or fight or do something. Then, just as the panic threatened to crush me, I heard a rustle from above. A drone hovered, its tiny propellers buzzing. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I was being watched. Whoever had been sending those messages, they'd used the drone to track me, to follow every step I took into the woods. The idea made my skin crawl, but at least I knew one thing. The footsteps had been real. Whoever had been walking through the woods was still out there, and I wasn't sure who was closer, me to the exit, or them to me. Being a high school teacher wasn't glamorous, but I'd grown used to the routine. The ring of the bell, the echo of teenagers' laughter, and the everyday chaos of the classroom. The day I confiscated that notebook, though none of it felt normal anymore. It was a Tuesday, sometime after lunch, when I spotted it. A small, leather-bound journal clenched in the hands of one of my quietest students. Aaron hardly ever spoke, his presence as unobtrusive as a shadow. So when I asked for the notebook, he handed it over without a word. His face remained blank, but something in his eyes made my stomach twist. When I flipped through it later, after school, the contents made my skin crawl. The first pages were covered in neat, obsessive handwriting. Each word felt heavy, sinister. There were detailed plans, almost surgical in their precision, describing violent scenarios that seemed almost too horrible to be imagined, let alone written. My hands grew clammy as I scanned through lists of names, some of which I recognized, students in my class, faculty members, even mine. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a story, some misguided attempt at creative writing. But the descriptions were too methodical, too well thought out. My head swam, and I dropped the notebook on my desk as if it were contaminated. Every instinct screamed that something was terribly wrong, but I knew I needed to handle it carefully. So I called the number Aaron had listed on his emergency contact form. When his parents answered, I explained what I'd found, trying to keep my voice steady. But there was a pause on the line that felt far too long. Aaron, his mother finally said, her voice brittle, "Our son has been missing for weeks." Her words sent a wave of dread crashing over me, leaving me breathless. Missing. But he'd been in class, quiet and detached as always, just hours earlier. The room felt too small, the air thin. I couldn't make sense of it, couldn't connect the missing boy his mother spoke of to the one who sat in my classroom, staring ahead like a ghost. A cold, tight feeling gripped my chest as I hung up the phone, and I swore I could hear my pulse drumming in my ears. I was the last teacher in the building that evening, the hallways growing dim as the sun set outside. Determined to turn the notebook over to the principal in the morning, I locked it in my desk and decided to leave. The emptiness of the school suddenly felt alive, pressing in on me. Each creak of the old floorboards echoed far too loudly, and my footsteps rang hollow in the silence. I was almost at the exit when I heard my name, a soft whisper coming from down the hall. I froze. The voice was familiar, unsettlingly so. It had to be my imagination, a product of too much stress and too little sleep. But then I heard it again, low and drawn out, coming from the direction of an empty classroom. I told myself it was ridiculous, but the dread was suffocating now, heavy and unrelenting. I turned slowly, every muscle tensed. The hallway was empty, just the usual rows of lockers and abandoned desks. But the classroom door was open, the one that should have been locked. It creaked on its hinges, like an invitation. Heart pounding, I stepped forward, telling myself I'd check quickly, prove there was nothing there. The room was cast in shadows, desks arranged in neat rows, and a chill seemed to radiate from the dark corners. I scanned the space, holding my breath, ready to bolt at the slightest movement. That's when I noticed it. Aaron's notebook, the one I had locked securely in my desk, sat in the middle of the teacher's podium. It was open, pages splayed, as if waiting for me. I swallowed, the air catching painfully in my throat. I hadn't imagined locking it away. Before I could move, a noise behind me made me spin around. It was a whisper, low and close, brushing past my ear like a cold breath. My knees went weak, and I stumbled back, knocking into one of the desks. The notebook snapped shut, and the whisper grew louder, morphing into a quiet, chilling laughter. I didn't wait. I ran, the echo of that laughter following me all the way to my car, only fading as I sped away from the school. When I returned the next morning, the notebook was gone. Aaron's seat in my class was empty, and no one seemed to remember him being there at all. No one but me. The more I tried to make sense of it, the more reality slipped away, leaving me with only one certainty. Something had happened in that classroom, and whatever it was, it had marked me. Working at a small coffee shop had its charms. The familiar clatter of mugs, the comforting hum of the espresso machine, and the rhythm of regulars who trickled in like clockwork. One of those regulars, a man I'd never really noticed until recently, always took the same seat by the window. He was nondescript, probably in his late 30s, with a face you'd forget as soon as you looked away. He came in daily, ordered a black coffee, and sat with a worn notebook, scribbling intently. There was nothing about him that seemed remarkable until the day he left the notebook behind. I found it tucked into the corner of his table after he'd gone. At first, I thought about handing it over to my manager or leaving it in the lost and found. But curiosity gnawed at me, and before I knew it, I'd opened the cover. My heart stuttered when I realized what I was looking at. Page after page was filled with descriptions of people. Detailed, obsessive, noting their habits, their clothing, even the way they fidgeted or laughed. Each entry was methodical, written with the kind of precision that felt unsettlingly clinical. My pulse quickened when I recognized the names of other regulars. An older woman who always read romance novels by the window, a college student who crammed for finals at the corner table. The descriptions were disturbingly accurate, almost intimate, as if he knew them far better than a stranger should. But it wasn't until I turned a few more pages that the air seemed to leave my lungs. The latest entries were about me. There was a description of my hair, the way I tucked it behind my ear when I worked the register. Notes on how often I checked my phone, how I lingered by the pastry case when the shop was empty. The last line on the page was written in a careful, slanted script that made my skin prickle. Tomorrow, it's her turn. My stomach twisted, and a wave of nausea hit me so hard I had to grip the table to stay upright. The words felt like a noose tightening around my throat. Was this a joke? A sick prank? I wanted to believe that. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that no one else knew these things about me, the tiny details he'd written down. I snapped the notebook shut, looking around the coffee shop as if the walls had eyes. The usual comforting space felt hostile, and every shadow seemed to hold something waiting, watching. I tried to convince myself I was overreacting, that I was letting a creepy notebook get under my skin. But then, a flash of movement outside the window caught my eye. The man, the one who always sat by the window, was standing on the sidewalk staring in. His expression was unreadable, his eyes locked onto mine. Fear crawled over my skin, cold and unrelenting. He shouldn't have been there. He never loitered, never made eye contact. My hands were shaking as I backed away from the window. I wanted to call someone, anyone, but my phone was locked in my locker in the back, and the few customers in the shop were blissfully unaware of the terror that had taken root inside me. He stayed there, unmoving, his gaze never wavering. The seconds stretched on, and I felt trapped, pinned under his scrutiny. Finally, he turned and walked away, vanishing into the flow of pedestrians on the street. Relief didn't come. Instead, the fear morphed into something deeper, more insidious. I didn't know if he was gone for good or just waiting for a better opportunity. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of my apartment seemed amplified, every shadow more sinister. I checked the locks on my door at least a dozen times. The next morning, the idea of going back to work felt like walking into a trap, but I had no choice. The thought of that notebook haunted me, the final entry looping in my mind. Tomorrow, it's her turn. When I arrived at the shop, my co-workers were chatting idly, oblivious to my nerves. The notebook was gone, the table spotless, and for a moment I thought maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. But as I tied on my apron, I noticed a slip of paper pinned to the bulletin board behind the register. It was blank except for a single line written in that same familiar, slanted handwriting. I'm always watching. My heart sank, and a cold sweat prickled along the back of my neck. Whoever he was, wherever he had gone, he hadn't just been a regular customer. He had always been paying attention. It was just after sunset when the man first appeared at my door. I was washing dishes in the warm glow of my kitchen, the last traces of daylight slipping away, when the doorbell rang. I wiped my hands and peeked through the window. He was standing there, clipboard in hand, wearing a crisp polo shirt with a charity logo stitched on the pocket. His smile was wide, almost too wide, and his eyes were the kind that seemed just a little too eager. Evening, he called out as I opened the door a few inches. He launched into a rehearsed spiel about donations for a local charity, something about helping the community. There was a practiced cheerfulness in his voice, but something felt off, as if it was only skin deep. I politely declined, closing the door quickly and locking it behind me. Over the next week, he showed up 2 more times, always with the same pitch, the same unnerving smile. Each time, my gut twisted a little tighter. It was his persistence, his unwavering tone, the way he never seemed to accept my polite refusals with any real disappointment. On the 3rd visit, his smile faltered slightly, just enough to reveal a glimpse of something else, something darker. I stopped answering the door after that, hoping he'd give up, but the anxiety settled deep in my chest. a cold knot that wouldn't let me rest. I found myself peeking out the windows at random times, half expecting to see him standing there. Days passed without incident, and I almost managed to convince myself that he was just an overzealous volunteer. Then, one night, everything changed. I was curled up on the couch, a movie playing softly in the background, when I felt that familiar sense of being watched. It was an instinct primal and unnerving, making the hairs on my neck prick up. I turned slowly, and there he was, standing across the street under the pale glow of a street lamp. His clipboard was gone, and he wasn't knocking on any doors. He was just watching. Panic flared in my chest, and I shrank back from the window, heart hammering. I grabbed my phone, debating whether to call the police, but I hesitated. What could I say? A man was standing on the sidewalk, looking at my house. It sounded paranoid, ridiculous, but the feeling of being trapped wouldn't let go. I locked every door and window, double-checking each one, and tried to settle my racing thoughts. Hours crawled by. I finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, only to be jolted awake by a noise, a soft scraping like someone trying to pry open a window. My body locked up, fear pooling like ice in my veins. I crept down the hall, each step feeling like a risk, and pressed my ear to the wall. The noise came again, deliberate and unhurried. I called the police, my voice shaking as I whispered my address and begged them to hurry. Waiting in that darkness, my breath coming in shallow, panic gasps, was the longest 20 minutes of my life. When the officers arrived, the man was gone, and there was no sign of forced entry. They did a brief sweep of the neighborhood, but he'd vanished. The next morning, I was exhausted, eyes aching from lack of sleep. I went straight to the police station, determined to report the man properly. That's when the officer at the desk looked at me with a mix of confusion and concern. "Ma'am, we don't have any record of a charity operating in this area," he said, voice firm. "And we've had no authorized collectors going door to door." A chill ran through me, colder than any fear I'd felt before. No charity, no authorized collection. The man's appearances, his too wide smile. All of it had been a facade, a game I hadn't even known I was playing. I never saw him again, but his presence lingered, a shadow I couldn't shake. Even now, I keep my doors locked tight and watch for any unfamiliar faces, because I can't help but wonder if he's still out there, waiting for the right moment to come back. I've always had a thing for old, forgotten items, the kind that seem to carry stories trapped within them. That's why, on a sleepy Saturday morning, I couldn't resist stopping at a garage sale down the street. Rows of dusty relics sprawled across the lawn, and at the center of it all was a large locked trunk. It looked aged but sturdy, with rusted clasps and a faded leather exterior. The mystery of what might be inside hooked me instantly. The owner was an elderly woman who seemed eager to get rid of everything. She sold me the trunk for a steal, smiling thinly as she handed it over. "Good luck getting it open," she said, almost as an afterthought. Something in her tone felt strange, but I brushed it off, too intrigued by the mystery to think twice. Back home, I spent hours prying at the rusted locks with a crowbar. The anticipation pulsed through me, mingling with a nervous thrill I couldn't quite explain. When the final lock gave way, the lid creaked open, revealing an unsettling collection of photographs. Hundreds of them, yellowed with age and curled at the edges. I pulled a few out, my fingers growing clammy as I studied them. They were all the same, images of people sleeping in their beds. Some were taken through partially open doors, others from the foot of the bed, but all were from inside bedrooms, too close for comfort. The angles, the shadows, they were disturbingly intimate, each shot capturing moments of pure vulnerability. My stomach twisted with a nauseating dread, and I suddenly wanted nothing more than to slam the lid shut and forget the whole thing. But I couldn't stop looking. I dug deeper, sifting through the photos, growing more horrified with each one. Then near the bottom of the trunk, I found a picture that made the room tilt around me. It was a photograph of me, taken from the corner of my own bedroom. The angle was unmistakable. I felt the world drop out from under me, my pulse roaring in my ears. I recognized the pajama shirt I was wearing, the one I'd only bought a month ago. This photo couldn't have been more than a few weeks old. The fear that settled in my chest was suffocating. My hands shook as I threw the pictures back into the trunk, slamming the lid shut, so hard it echoed through the room. I backed away, staring at the closed trunk like it might spring open on its own. This wasn't just some creepy find at a garage sale. It was personal. Someone had been in my house, in my room, watching me. I ran through the house, checking every lock, every window. The idea of someone having access to my home, of being close enough to take that photo, made my skin crawl. I tried to piece it together. Was it the old woman? Did she know what was in the trunk, or was she just another pawn in whatever sick game this was? That night, sleep was impossible. Every noise, every creak of the floorboards sounded like a footstep. I lay in bed with a bat clutched in my hands, eyes darting to the corners of the room. Even the shadows seemed to press in closer, heavy with an unspoken threat. At some point, I must have drifted into an uneasy doze, only to be jolted awake by the sound of something scraping across the floor. I sat up, heart pounding. The trunk. It had moved, just an inch, but enough to make a noise. I could see the scrape marks on the floor, fresh and glaring. Panic gripped me, and I stumbled out of bed, bat raised. My breath came in shallow, terrified bursts. I forced myself to check the room, even though every nerve screamed at me to run. The trunk was closed, still and silent. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, that whatever was tied to that trunk wasn't finished with me yet. I dragged it out to the backyard before dawn, digging a hole in the damp, cold earth with shaking hands. I buried it as deep as I could, throwing the dirt over it like I was trying to cover up a nightmare. But even now, even with the trunk buried and out of sight, I still feel watched, like something is waiting, patient and hidden, just beyond the edges of the light. Losing my backpack was a stupid mistake, but it had been a long day. I was exhausted, distracted, and left it on the bus without realizing until I was nearly home. I rushed back to the station, hoping it had ended up in the lost and found. The whole way there, an uneasy feeling churned in my gut, a sense that something was wrong that I couldn't shake. When I arrived, the attendant at the counter handed over a backpack with my name scrawled in permanent marker on the side. Relief washed over me for a split second, but then my fingers went cold as I unzipped it. The contents were all wrong, and a wave of nausea swept over me. Instead of my books, my charger, and a crumpled lunch bag, I found a knife, a pair of latex gloves, and a list. A list of names. I froze, my brain struggling to process what I was looking at. The names were all familiar, my teachers, classmates, even friends. Some had details written beside them, chilling notes like corner desk by the window or gym locker number 112. My heart thudded painfully in my chest as the reality set in. Someone had packed this bag intentionally, and they knew far too much about the people in my life. A sickening dread took root, and I couldn't get my hands to stop shaking. I zipped the bag shut, feeling exposed, like eyes were on me even though the station was mostly empty. Logic and panic warred in my mind. Had someone swapped my bag on purpose? Was I being set up? Or was it a threat, a way to show they could reach me and anyone around me? I stumbled out of the station, my legs barely carrying me. The air outside felt thinner, like I couldn't get enough oxygen no matter how deeply I breathed. I made it home, locking the door behind me and double-checking every window. The list stayed burned into my thoughts, each name a countdown I didn't understand. I couldn't shake the paranoia, the feeling that I was being watched. Then came the knock at the door, loud and commanding. I jolted upright, my heart hammering. Through the peephole, I saw 2 police officers. Their expressions were grim. An avalanche of fear swept through me as I opened the door, barely able to keep myself from shaking. "Is this your backpack?" one officer asked, holding up the bag I had just been handed at the station. Before I could answer, they exchanged a look that made my stomach drop. They were here for more than a lost bag. "We need to ask you some questions about a serious incident that occurred at your school today." I didn't even have time to process what they said before they asked me to step outside. Panic crashed over me, a suffocating wave. My mind raced through possibilities, but none of them made sense. I didn't know what had happened, but somehow I was being pulled into it, a pawn in something sinister. They wouldn't tell me the details right away, only that someone had been hurt, and my name was now part of their investigation. Every defense I tried to muster sounded hollow, like the walls of my world were caving in, and I had no way to prove I wasn't involved. That backpack had painted me as a suspect, and the more I tried to explain, the more I realized how trapped I was. The fear didn't fade. It only twisted deeper, leaving me wondering who had set this up, and if they were still out there, watching and waiting for me to fall apart. The emergency alert came in the middle of a quiet evening, when everything seemed painfully ordinary. I had been mindlessly scrolling through my phone, a half-empty glass of wine on the coffee table and some old sitcom rerun playing in the background. When the shrill alert blasted through my phone, I nearly dropped it. The message was stark and chilling. Citywide lockdown. Remain indoors. Stay away from windows. Await further instructions. The calm, familiar atmosphere shattered, replaced by a suffocating tension. I stared at the alert, rereading it over and over, trying to process the words. Was it real? It had to be, but there was no additional information, no news breaking on the TV. My hands were clammy, and I set my phone down as if it had burned me. I crossed the living room in a daze and peeked out the front window, heart pounding. The street was quiet, disturbingly normal. Cars sat parked along the curb, and porch lights flickered on as twilight deepened. A couple walked their dog down the sidewalk, seemingly unaware of the emergency order that had just shattered my world. Stay away from windows. The words echoed in my mind, and I backed away, pulling the curtains tight. A feeling of helplessness crept over me, a suffocating fear that didn't match the serene scene outside. Maybe it was a mistake, a glitch. But what if it wasn't? My thoughts spiraled, and I realized I needed answers. I called the non-emergency police line. The hold music droned in my ear, but when someone finally answered, they sounded almost bored. "Ma'am, there is no citywide lockdown," the operator said. "We've received several calls, but there's no emergency." I hung up, my heart still hammering, feeling no relief. The sense of unease had lodged itself under my skin, and I couldn't shake it. Something wasn't right. I grabbed my phone again, refreshing the news, checking social media, anything for confirmation. But everything was quiet, normal. Then came the footsteps. Faint but unmistakable, they crept through my hallway. The sound turned my fear into a physical weight pressing against my chest. I held my breath, straining to listen. The footsteps grew louder, coming closer, deliberate and slow. My first instinct was to run, to make a mad dash for the front door. But the emergency alert flashed in my mind, telling me to stay inside, to hide. I ducked behind the couch, heart pounding so loudly I thought it might give me away. The air felt thick and heavy, every creak of the floorboards sending a jolt of terror through me. I could hear the footsteps clearer now, pacing, as if someone was deciding what to do next. My mind raced with possibilities. A burglar, a stalker, or worse. But what gnawed at me most was the timing. The alert, the footsteps, it felt calculated, intentional. My phone vibrated in my hand, and I nearly screamed. Another alert had come through. This time, the message was different. Evacuate immediately. The threat is inside. The words sucked the air from my lungs. The threat was inside my house. Panic took over. My body flooded with adrenaline. I knew I couldn't stay hidden. I had to move. Staying crouched low, I crept toward the kitchen, avoiding the hall where the footsteps had been. Each step felt like a test, like one wrong move would give me away. I grabbed the biggest knife from the drawer, gripping it so hard my hand hurt. The house had fallen silent. I strained to hear any movement, but there was nothing, just an oppressive stillness that felt unnatural. I debated calling the police again, but what if making noise drew attention? What if I only had seconds left? I inched closer to the back door, knife in hand, ready to bolt. That's when I noticed the lock. It had been undone. A chill ran through me, colder than anything I'd ever felt. I hadn't unlocked that door. Someone else had, and they were still here, somewhere in the dark, silent corners of my home. Before I could decide what to do next, the lights flickered, plunging the house into darkness. My breath caught in my throat, and I knew, without a doubt, that I wasn't alone. The letter appeared on a cold Tuesday morning. I was groggy, still waking up as I pulled it from my mailbox, a plain white envelope with my name written in perfect block letters. No stamp, no return address. A thread of unease tugged at me as I flipped it over, my breath catching in the chilly air. I took it inside, setting it on the kitchen counter while I made coffee. My hands wouldn't stop trembling, a reaction that felt ridiculous given the mundane sight of a letter. I told myself it was just some mistake, maybe an old neighbor trying to reconnect. But the more I looked at it, the more a creeping sense of dread settled in. Finally, I couldn't wait any longer. I tore it open and unfolded a single sheet of paper. The contents made my blood run cold. It was a detailed account of my daily routine, the exact time I left the house for work, the way I picked up my mail when I returned, even the way I'd adjust the blinds in the living room each evening. The descriptions were precise, clinical, and disturbingly accurate. The letter ended with one line, written in the same block handwriting. "You don't notice me, but I always notice you." I dropped the paper as if it had burned me, my pulse thudding in my ears. The quiet safety of my home seemed to evaporate, replaced by a crawling sense of vulnerability. Someone had been watching me, cataloging my habits like a predator learning its prey. Panic gripped me. I rushed to the windows, peering through the blinds, but the street outside was calm, unchanged. Every shadow, every parked car felt like a potential hiding place. My paranoia had me scanning for faces I might recognize, anyone who seemed to linger too long. Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I tried to convince myself that I was being paranoid, but the evidence was there, clear as day, mocking my attempt to stay rational. I started changing my routine, leaving at different times, taking alternate routes to work, even altering which lights I turned on at night. It didn't matter. The next letter came 3 days later. This one was more chilling because it mentioned things I had done only after receiving the first letter. The writer was keeping up, adapting, always a step ahead. They wrote about how they enjoyed my attempts to outsmart them, how amusing it was to watch me jump at every small sound. "You won't see me coming," it concluded, and this time the fear was a living, breathing thing. I filed a report with the police, but they had little to go on. No fingerprints, no leads, just vague reassurances that they'd look into it. I began locking every window, every door, even during the day. But the changes started small. A window I knew I'd locked left ajar, my back door unlocked in the morning, even though I was certain I'd secured it. Every discovery felt like a violation, a reminder that I wasn't safe no matter how many precautions I took. Then came the smell. It was faint at first, barely noticeable, but soon unmistakable. The sharp, musky scent of cologne. It was in the hallway, lingering near the stairs, as if someone had been standing there, just waiting. I'd never worn that scent, never bought it. The realization that someone had been inside my home, close enough to leave their presence behind, made me feel sick. I called the police again, but they found no sign of forced entry. Nothing was stolen. Nothing seemed disturbed. I could tell they were beginning to think I was losing it. But I knew what I smelled, what I felt. The letter writer was taunting me, eroding my sense of safety until I was nothing but a bundle of raw nerves. The last letter arrived a week later. I was afraid to open it, but I had to know. It was short, only one sentence this time. "See you tonight." I didn't sleep. I sat in the dark, clutching a kitchen knife, flinching at every creak of the house. The hours dragged on, and by dawn, I was exhausted, but no one had come. Nothing happened, but the damage was done. I wasn't the same. The letters had taken away more than my peace of mind. They'd taken my sense of safety, my belief in the sanctity of my own home. Even now, I wonder if the thread is gone or if they're just waiting, patient and silent, until I least expect it. It started with the absence. Mrs. Thompson, my elderly neighbor, had always been a fixture in our apartment complex. She'd wave from her tiny balcony, tend to her endless collection of potted plants, and chat with anyone who passed by. So, when days turned into weeks without a single sighting, I couldn't help but feel that something was wrong. The building management sealed off her door with a simple statement: renovations. But that word sat heavy in the air, an explanation that never quite felt complete. Every time I walked past her door, I felt that uncomfortable prickle of unfinished business. It didn't help that management seemed tight-lipped, brushing off questions with vague shrugs. The floor she'd once brought to life now felt empty, as if her absence had sucked out all the warmth. Late one night, as I struggled to sleep, I heard it, a muffled, shuffling sound coming from Mrs. Thompson's apartment. My body stiffened, every muscle taut as I strained to listen. The sound came again, this time joined by something else, a faint, soft weeping. It was unmistakable, the kind of broken, desolate crying that wormed its way into your bones. Goosebumps prickled my skin, and my heartbeat pounded so loudly I thought it might give me away. The logical part of me wanted to dismiss it. Maybe it was an echo from another floor, someone having a rough night. But the noise didn't fade. It seemed trapped in that dark, sealed-off apartment, like a wound that wouldn't heal. I pulled myself out of bed and crept into the hallway, each step feeling heavier than the last. The door to Mrs. Thompson's apartment loomed, closed and forbidding, with that damn renovations notice mocking me from the surface. I pressed my ear to the cold wood, holding my breath. The crying had stopped, replaced by a low, rhythmic creaking like someone rocking back and forth in an old chair. The unsettling quiet made my pulse race, and I felt trapped in that moment, unable to move or think. Just as I was about to pull away, the sound stopped abruptly, and I swore I felt something shift behind the door, as if someone had come closer. A sudden rush of fear sent me stumbling back, and I hurried to my apartment, locking the door behind me. My hands were trembling, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, had been listening. Sleep didn't come easily after that. The next morning, I confronted the building manager. His face darkened when I brought up the sounds I'd heard. "Mind your own business," he snapped, the sharpness in his voice cutting through any further questions. His reaction only added to the growing sense of dread. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was being hidden, and Mrs. Thompson's disappearance wasn't as simple as they wanted us to believe. Days went by, but the noises continued. Sometimes it was the faint rustle of movement, other times that haunting sound of someone crying. It gnawed at me, a constant reminder that whatever was sealed behind that door wasn't at peace. I started avoiding the hallway altogether, the fear of what I might hear becoming too much. Then one night, as I was making dinner, something caught my eye. A flash of movement outside the window, a pale, bony hand reaching through the gap in one of the boarded-up panes of Mrs. Thompson's apartment. My heart slammed against my ribs, and I nearly dropped the pot I was holding. I ran to the window, pressing my face against the glass to see better. The hand was gone, and the boards rattled in the wind. But I knew what I'd seen. It was as real as the fear crawling up my spine, as real as the sense that Mrs. Thompson's story wasn't over. I don't know what happened to her, or why the building management is so desperate to keep that door closed. But I do know one thing. Some absences don't stay silent forever. Friends, please support my channel by subscribing and liking it. You are the best.